The silence in the high desert of New Mexico isn't an absence of sound. It's a physical weight, a thick, suffocating blanket of static that makes your teeth ache and your skin crawl. Out here, where the horizon is a jagged line of obsidian against a bruised purple sky, the wind doesn't just blow. It hisses through the scrub brush like a dying man trying to whisper a secret he should have taken to his grave. My name is Marcus, and for 12 years, I've been the night shift groundskeeper at San Judas. It's an isolated patch of consecrated earth, or so the signs say, wedged between the skeletal remains of an abandoned mining town and the vast, uncaring void of the desert. People think being a graveyard shift worker is about solitude and the occasional stray dog. They think the dead stay down because they're tired. They're wrong. In New Mexico, the earth is too dry to hold onto anything for long, and the secrets buried beneath the caliche have a way of clawing their way back toward the light. The air tonight is thick with the scent of ozone and parched dust, a storm brewing somewhere over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains but refusing to break. My flashlight beam is a weak, yellow finger poking at the gloom, illuminating the swirling dust motes that dance like flakes of dead skin in the air. I was never supposed to find the basement. The groundskeeper's shack is a lean-to of rotting wood and rusted corrugated metal, a place where the heat of the day lingers long into the midnight hours. But 3 weeks ago, a heavy rain, the kind that turns the desert floor into a slurrying trap of red mud, caused the floorboards beneath the heavy iron tool chest to sag and snap. Beneath the splintered pine, I didn't find dirt. I found a ladder. It was a vertical descent into a pocket of air that hadn't moved since the Truman administration. The smell hit me first, not the sweet rot of a fresh corpse, but something older, sharper. It smelled like calcified bone, scorched hair, and the metallic tang of dried blood that had turned to copper dust over the decades. My flashlight flickered, the orange glow stuttering as if the darkness down there was trying to swallow the batteries whole. I found myself in a room no larger than a root cellar, lined with shelves of grey steel. On those shelves were hundreds of ledger books, their leather covers cracked and peeling like sunburnt flesh. These weren't the official county death certificates I kept in the main office. These were the unofficial records, the black files, the things the people of this county had been trying to forget since before the state had a name. I pulled the first book from the shelf. The paper was translucent, brittle as a dragonfly's wing. The handwriting was a frantic, jagged scrawl that looked more like a series of scars than letters. As I turned the pages, the dread began to pull in my stomach like cold lead. This graveyard, San Judas, wasn't built to honor the dead. It wasn't a place for grieving widows to lay lilies on marble slabs. It was a containment zone, a landfill for the things that couldn't be explained, the things that were hunted in the dark of the canyons and the shadows of the mesas. The ground beneath my boots wasn't just a resting place, it was a prison. Every unmarked grave, every stone can I'd mowed around for a decade, was a cork in a bottle. I sat there on the cold concrete floor, the flickering light of my lamp casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move independently of my own limbs. I read about the ranchers who didn't just lose sheep, but lost their minds when they saw what was eating them. I read about the surveyors who vanished into the rocky hills, leaving only pulverized bone behind. I read about the neighbors who looked like your brother, talked like your brother, but moved with the jerky, unnatural precision of a marionette held by invisible, trembling hands. The record spoke of a containment zone strategy, a systematic effort by the local militias and forgotten lawmen to bury the unnatural deep enough that the sun wouldn't find them. The more I read, the more the graveyard outside changed. I looked up at the ceiling, sensing the weight of the acres of soil above me. I thought of the dead grass patches that never grew, no matter how much water I hauled. I thought of the way the crows avoided row 14, and how the air always felt 5 degrees colder near the old slab in the north expansion. I wasn't a gardener. I was a jailer. And as the orange light of my flashlight began to fade, dying into a dull, pulsing amber, I realized that some of the entries in these books were recent. The desert was still producing monsters, and the town was still bringing them here, to me, to keep them under the dirt. The visceral reality of it settled into my marrow. The scratches I heard at night weren't coyotes. The shifting of the soil wasn't the wind. It was the weight of 100 years of nightmares trying to breathe. My fingers trembled as I traced the jagged ink of the first entry, a story from a rancher named Elias who found out the hard way that some things don't bleed red. I realized then that the silence of San Judas wasn't peace. It was a bated breath. It was the sound of something waiting for the light to finally, mercifully, go out. I reached for the next ledger, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and began to read the first of the incidents that would haunt my every waking hour. I had to know what was under my feet. I had to know why the soil stayed dead. The first record was dated October 1922. The ink was faded, but the words were etched with such violence they nearly tore through the parchment. It started with a rancher, a man named Elias, who lived on the jagged edge of the flats where the scrub gives way to the deep arroyos. He wasn't a man given to flights of fancy. He was a man of leather and grit. But even he couldn't explain the puncture wounds. He couldn't explain why his livestock were being emptied of their life, left as hollow, leathery husks in the moonlight with not a single drop of blood on the straw. The description of the thing they caught in the barn, the thing they brought here to bury in the dark, made the air in the basement feel like it was turning to ice. I could almost hear the rattle of its ridged spine against the wooden slats of the barn, almost see the orange glow of its eyes reflecting in the dying light of my own torch. This was the beginning of the archive. This was the birth of the zone. And as I turned the page, I knew I was no longer just a witness. I was part of the record now. The void was staring back, and it was hungry. The file in my hands felt heavier than paper should. It felt dense, like it was bound in lead or perhaps something more sinister, something that didn't want the light of my flashlight to touch its ink. I sat in the cramped security hut, the New Mexico wind howling against the corrugated metal walls like a choir of the damned, and I focused on the first entry. The incident of the Thorn Ranch, 1952. The paper was yellowed, stained with something dark and oily at the edges, and the handwriting was a frantic, sloping cursive that seemed to vibrate under my gaze. The desert is a place of desiccation, a vast, hungry void that swallows sound and life with equal indifference. But what happened at the Thorn Ranch wasn't just the desert being cruel. It was something from the outside, something that had slipped through a crack in the world and decided to feed. Elias Thorn was a man of the earth, hardened by decades of sun and dust. He knew the rhythms of the land, the language of the coyotes, and the silent warnings of the rattlesnakes. But one Tuesday morning, the silence was different. It was heavy. It was static. He walked out to the northern pasture and found the first of his Holsteins. It didn't look like a kill. It looked like a discarded husk. The cow was upright, its legs locked in a rigor that defied biology, but its insides were gone. There were no claw marks, no jagged tears in the hide. Just two clean, surgical punctures at the base of the skull. Elias touched the animal's flank, and it didn't feel like flesh. It felt like dried parchment. When he pressed his thumb against the hide, the cow simply collapsed into a heap of brittle bones and grey, dust-like powder. There was no blood. Not a single drop had reached the parched earth. The vacuum of the wound had been absolute. By the end of the week, 7 more were gone. 7 hollowed-out monuments to a hunger that didn't belong in this ecosystem. Panic is a cold thing. It starts in the marrow and works its way out. Elias didn't call the sheriff. He knew the law wouldn't have a name for what was happening. Instead, he called Vance and Miller, 2 men who had hunted every predator from the Gila to the Pecos. They arrived with Winchesters and a desperation that smelled like cheap whiskey and sweat. They set the trap in the main barn, a cavernous structure of rotting timber and long, jagged shadows. The moonlight filtered through the gaps in the roof, casting silver bars across the dirt floor, creating a cage of light and dark. They waited. The air in the barn grew thick, a humid, cloying pressure that made the skin itch. It smelled of old hay and something else, something metallic, like copper and ozone. Around midnight, the static started. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. It was a vibration in the teeth. The horses in the nearby stalls didn't scream. They whimpered, a low, guttural sobbing that turned my stomach as I read the report. Then, the shadows in the corner of the barn began to move. Not like a living thing, but like a glitch in reality. It dropped from the rafters with a sound like a wet sheet hitting the floor. Elias described it as a mutation of geometry. It had a ridged spine that looked like a row of obsidian knives, glowing faintly with a sickly, rhythmic pulse. Its front legs were unnaturally long, ending in multi-jointed appendages that clicked against the wood like needles. And the eyes. They weren't eyes. They were 2 orbs of burning, pressurized orange light, glowing with the intensity of a furnace. The panic broke first. Miller fired. The muzzle flash illuminated the creature for a fraction of a second, revealing skin that looked like bruised fruit, translucent and wet. The bullet hit the creature's chest, but instead of blood, a spray of grey, viscous fluid geezered out, smelling of sulfur and rot. The beast didn't flinch. It didn't roar. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pressurized valve. It moved with a jagged, stop-motion precision, covering the distance between the shadows and the men in a heartbeat. Vance screamed as the thing swung one of those long, needle-thin limbs. It didn't cut, it pierced. Elias watched in frozen horror as the creature's limb entered Vance's shoulder and exited his lower back, the man's body twitching like an insect pinned to a board. Elias and Miller unleashed a barrage of gunfire. The barn was filled with the thunder of lead and the screams of the dying horses. The creature was being shredded, its ridged spine cracking, its glowing eyes flickering like dying bulbs. It was dying, but it wasn't finished. In its final, spasming moments, the entity lunged at Elias. He tried to club it with the butt of his rifle, but the creature caught his forearm in its mandibles. It wasn't a bite. It was a puncture. Elias felt the heat immediately, a searing, liquid fire that surged into his veins. He fell back, kicking at the thing as it finally went limp, its orange eyes fading into a dull, smoky grey. The men didn't wait for morning. They dragged the carcass out into the cold moonlight, their hands shaking so hard they could barely hold the shovels. They dug a hole deep into the New Mexico caliche, far from the ranch house, in a section of the land that felt wrong even before the burial. They dumped the thing in, the smell of its decomposing fluid making Miller vomit until he was dry heaving bile. They covered it with lime and rocks, a silent pact of silence sealed in the dirt. But the earth doesn't forget, and the bite didn't heal. Elias Thorne died 6 days later. The report included a photograph of his arm, and I had to turn my head away for a moment. It wasn't just gangrene. The infection was necrotizing, yes, but it was also transforming. The skin around the bite had turned the same translucent, bruised color as the creature. Small, crystalline ridges had begun to sprout from his radius, tearing through the muscle from the inside out. His blood had turned into that same gray, oily sludge. He spent his final hours screaming for water, but every drop he drank turned to steam in his throat. They buried Elias here, in the cemetery I now patrol. They put him in an unmarked grave, barely 20 yards from where they had disposed of the beast on the ranch, a symmetry demanded by some dark logic. The county records list it as a heart attack. The archive knows better. I stood up from the desk, my legs heavy, and grabbed my lantern. I needed to see it. I walked out into the graveyard, the desert wind biting at my face. I knew exactly where to go. Section 4, row 12. The air there always felt thinner, colder. I reached the spot where the records indicated the creature's remains had been relocated after the ranch was sold and the site excavated for safety reasons. I lowered my lantern. The soil in the rest of the graveyard is sparse, yes, but there are clumps of grama grass, the occasional stubborn cactus, a few hardy weeds clinging to life. But here, over the creature's resting place, the earth is dead. Not just dry. Dead. It is a circle of absolute desolation, about 6 feet wide. The dirt is a charred, ashen grey, fine as flour. Nothing grows there. No insects crawl across it. Even the wind seems to avoid blowing dust over it. It is a void in the landscape, a physical manifestation of the necrotizing rot that took Elias Thorne. I reached down and touched the edge of the circle. The ground was freezing, despite the daytime heat. It felt like touching the skin of a corpse. As I stood there, the silence of the cemetery seemed to deepen. I looked over at the unmarked headstone of Elias Thorne, just a few yards away. The grass there was brown and shriveled, leaning away from the creature's grave as if in a silent, eternal retreat. The infection hadn't stopped with Elias. It had leaked into the land. It was a mutation of the very concept of death. Here, in the containment zone, the dead don't just rest. They fester. They change the chemistry of the world around them. I looked back down at the dead soil. For a second, just a flicker of a second, I thought I saw a faint, orange glow pulsing beneath the ashen surface, a heartbeat of light in the cold dark. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, the jagged language of the archive echoing in my skull. The void wasn't just staring back. It was spreading, and I was the only one left to watch the rot grow. The static in my teeth started again, and I realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated panic that the moonlight wasn't cold anymore. It felt like needles against my skin. I turned and ran back toward the light of the security hut, the smell of ozone and sulfur clinging to my uniform like a shroud. I was part of the record now, and the record was written in blood that wouldn't stay red. The security hut felt like a coffin made of cheap plywood and humming fluorescent light. My hand shook as I reached for the next manila folder, the paper brittle and yellowed, smelling of stagnant attics and old, dried rot. I needed to know. I needed to understand why the ground beneath my feet felt less like earth and more like a scab waiting to be picked. The file was dated 1934. It was the era of dust and desperation, a time when the desert seemed determined to swallow the living whole. But the records from that year didn't speak of drought or poverty. They spoke of a weight that the world was never meant to carry. The survey crew had been sent into the rocky hills north of the settlement, led by a man named Silas. He was a veteran of the wild, a man whose skin was cured leather and whose eyes were fixed on the horizon. They were supposed to map the jagged geometry of the New Mexico Badlands, to impose order on a landscape that thrived on chaos. But as the sun dipped below the peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the arroyos, they found something that defied the logic of the compass. Silas first noted the depressions in the grey twilight. They weren't footprints so much as they were geological events. Massive, oval-shaped craters pressed deep into the sun-baked clay, spaced so far apart that no human, no horse, could have bridged the gap in a single stride. There was a static in the air that evening, a hum that vibrated in the teeth of the men as they made camp. Silas wrote in his log about the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the wilderness. It was a void. The crickets had stopped. The coyotes had vanished. The hills were just black silhouettes against a sky the color of a fresh bruise. They huddled around a fire that felt small and pathetic against the encroaching dark. Tobias, the youngest of the crew, was the first to hear the sound. It wasn't a growl or a scream. It was a rhythmic, bone-deep thud. The ground didn't just shake, it groaned. The earth was being compressed by a mass that shouldn't exist. Then it stepped out of the grey haze. Silas didn't describe a monster in the traditional sense. He described a behemoth. It was a colossus of broad shoulders and dense, matte black flesh that seemed to absorb the light of the stars. It moved with a slow, agonizing deliberation, each footfall a tectonic shift. It was a mountain that had decided to walk. There was no communication, no warning. The entity simply reached into the camp. The speed was the most terrifying part, a contradiction to its size. A massive, slab-like hand descended, and the sound that followed was the sickening, wet crunch of a ribcage being pulverized. One of the men was flattened into the dirt before he could even draw breath. Silas stood his ground, firing his rifle until the barrel burned his palms. He watched the bullet strike the entity's chest, seeing the lead disappear into the dark hide with a dull thud, like pebbles thrown into a lake of thick oil. There was no blood. There was no flinching. The creature turned its eyeless face toward him and swung a limb with the force of a falling redwood. Silas's spine didn't just break, it shattered. The record described the sound as dry timber snapping in a winter storm. He was tossed aside like a broken doll, his lower half instantly rendered a foreign, useless weight. Tobias watched from the shadows of a jagged rock formation, paralyzed by a divine sort of terror. He saw the behemoth loom over the dying Silas, its presence so vast it seemed to blot out the moon. It didn't eat them. It didn't hunt them for sport. It simply crushed them for being in its path, an indifferent god of blunt force. Tobias fled through the night, his lungs burning with the taste of alkali dust and fear. He ran until his boots fell apart, until he reached the hospital in town, his mind a fractured mess of images. Before his heart gave out from the sheer physical trauma of the flight, he whispered the coordinates. He told them where the mountain walked. A posse was formed, but they didn't go with just pistols and bravado. They went with the heavy hardware of men who knew they were hunting a nightmare. They found the beast standing amidst the rocky spires, motionless, like a statue carved from the night itself. It took hours. The report spoke of a sustained, deafening barrage. Heavy rifle fire, over and over, focused on the chest and the massive, featureless head. They had to tear the creature apart with lead, layer by layer, until it finally toppled. When it fell, the impact was felt in the town miles away, a tremor that cracked windows and sent dogs into a howling frenzy. They didn't try to study it. The men of 1934 knew better than to invite that kind of rot into their minds. They dragged the carcass back to the graveyard under the cover of a moonless sky, using teams of horses that screamed and strained against the impossible weight. They buried it in a long, deep trench in what we now call the North Quad. But they didn't bury it alone. In a gesture of grim, Gothic irony, they laid Silas and his slaughtered crew in the same row, just feet away from the thing that had unmade them. I left the security hut and walked out into the grey New Mexico night, my flashlight cutting a weak path through the mist. I knew exactly where that row was. I had mowed the grass over it a dozen times, but I had never looked closely at the topography. Now, with the knowledge of the 1934 file burning in my skull, I saw it. The sinking row. It wasn't just uneven ground. The entire strip of earth, from the unmarked mound of the Behemoth to the weathered headstones of the survey crew, was depressed, a shallow valley in the middle of the cemetery. I stood at the edge of it, the silence of the graveyard pressing against my eardrums like deep water. I stepped onto the soil of the row, and the feeling was instantaneous. It wasn't solid. It felt like walking on a thin crust of bread over a vat of gelatin. The earth gave way under my boots, sinking an inch, then two. I shone my light down at the base of Silas's headstone. The granite was tilted at a sharp, unnatural angle, being swallowed by the dirt. The soil here was dark, almost black, and completely devoid of life. No weeds grew here. No ants built their hills. The earth was constantly collapsing in on itself, as if the weight of the Behemoth was still pulling everything down into a subterranean void. I looked toward the end of the row, where the entity lay. The ground there was a deep pit, a literal scar in the landscape that no amount of fill dirt could ever level. It felt as though the gravity in this specific spot was stronger, a localized pull toward the center of the earth. I felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of absolute helplessness. We think we bury things to forget them. We think 6 feet of dirt is a barrier. But standing there, feeling the ground settle and groan beneath my weight, I realized the truth. The cemetery wasn't a place of rest. It was a lid. And the lid was failing. The Behemoth wasn't rotting. It was too dense for decay, too wrong for the natural cycle of the earth. It was simply sitting there in the dark, its massive bulk slowly warping the reality of the soil around it. I could almost hear the sound of Silas's spine snapping again, echoing up through the layers of silt and stone. I backed away from the sinking row, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The awe of it was a cold, sharp blade. To think that something so massive, so indifferent to our existence, was held just a few feet below my boots. As I retreated toward the gravel path, I saw a pebble roll into the depression of the row. It didn't stop. It kept rolling, drawn toward the center of the Behemoth's grave, until it vanished into a small crack in the parched earth. The ground was hungry. It was a slow, geological appetite that would eventually pull the entire graveyard, and perhaps the town itself, into that silent, black maw. I reached the safety of the path, my breath coming in jagged gasps, the smell of ozone returning to my nostrils. The records weren't just history. They were a warning. The earth in New Mexico doesn't want to hold these things. It's trying to let them go, or perhaps it's being pulled down with them. Either way, I was just a witness to the slow-motion collapse of a world that was never ours to begin with. The smell of the archive was more than just old paper and damp stone. It was the scent of a long-festering secret, a kind of psychological rot that seeped out of the manila folders and clung to my skin like graveyard mist. I turned the page of the county records, my fingers trembling slightly as I moved from the crushing weight of the Behemoth to something far more insidious. Something that didn't rely on brute force, but on the systematic violation of the self. The next file was labeled with a name that sounded too ordinary for the horror it contained, Matteo Valenzuela. But the subtitle, written in a jagged, frantic hand, made the bile rise in my throat. It read, "The skin that does not fit." It happened in the late autumn of a year the county would rather forget. Matteo was a local electrician, a man of wires and light, known for his steady hands and a smile that seemed to warm the cold New Mexico nights. He was the kind of person you'd trust with your keys, the kind of neighbor who knew the rhythm of the town by heart. Until the rhythm broke. The report started as whispers at the local diner, the kind of talk people dismiss as exhaustion or the tricks of a desert sunset. People claimed they saw Matteo walking through the scrubland at hours he should have been asleep. But he wasn't just walking. He was moving with a staccato, frame-by-frame jerkiness, like a film reel skipping teeth. Then the visitations began. The records detail a series of unsettling domestic encounters that read like a descent into a collective fever dream. Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow on the edge of town, reported Matteo standing in her kitchen at 3 in the morning. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there, illuminated by the rhythmic pulse of a dying fluorescent bulb. When she asked him why he was there, he didn't answer with words. He tilted his head at an angle that should have snapped his cervical vertebrae and repeated her question back to him. But the voice wasn't his. It was a jagged, electronic approximation of her own voice, layered over a low hum of static. He didn't walk out the door when she threatened him with a fireplace poker. He simply slid backward into the shadows of the pantry, his limbs moving with a sickening, liquid precision that defied the mechanics of bone and joint. The paranoia turned into a sharp, visceral terror when Mateja's own sister, Elena, finally faced the thing that was wearing her brother's face. She was at home, the domestic lamps flickering as a dry storm rolled in from the plains. She heard Mateja in the hallway, the familiar heavy tread of his work boots. But the timing was wrong. The footsteps were rhythmic, perfectly spaced, like a machine trying to mimic the gait of a man but failing to understand the nuance of weight and balance. When he entered the living room, he was standing in the doorway, his reflection distorted in the glass of a framed family photo. Elena looked at the reflection and her blood turned to ice. In the glass, Mateja's face was a featureless void, a smooth slab of grey matter where eyes and a mouth should be. But when she looked at him directly, he looked perfectly normal. Almost. The thing sat down on the sofa across from her. It didn't sink into the cushions. It perched on top of them, rigid and unnatural. It began to speak, but the words were hollow, echoing things. It called her Lana. It mispronounced the name she had heard her brother say 10,000 times. It spoke in a monotone that felt like a serrated blade across her nerves. As the lamps continued to struggle against the local grid, the light caught the thing's neck. Elena saw it then. The skin was bunching at the collarbone, folding over itself in thick, waxy layers that looked like melting tallow. It wasn't his skin. It was a shroud, a poorly tailored costume stretched over something that didn't have a human shape. When the thing reached out a hand toward her, the fingers elongated by an extra 3 inches in a sudden, sickening burst of growth. Elena didn't scream. She couldn't. She simply bolted out the back door and ran until her lungs burned with the desert air. The real Mateja was found 3 days later. He hadn't been missing. He had been discarded. His body was discovered in a shallow ravine outside of town, bludgeoned with a savagery that suggested a deep, impersonal hatred. He had been dead for at least a week, his body already succumbing to the rotting heat of the New Mexico sun. The realization hit the town like a physical blow. If Mateja was dead in the dirt, then what was currently walking through their halls and sitting at their tables? A local militia was formed within hours. They didn't go to the sheriff. They went to the site where Mateja's body had been found, instinctively knowing the mimic would return to the scene of its theft. They set an ambush in the jagged rocks, the air thick with the smell of sage and looming violence. When the doppelganger arrived, it wasn't walking anymore. It was lurching, its body struggling to maintain the illusion of humanity. The skin was sagging now, grey and translucent, sliding off the high peaks of its cheekbones like wet paper. They didn't wait for a greeting. They opened fire. The sound of the rifles was a jagged tear in the silence of the canyon. But the thing didn't fall. It didn't even bleed. Each bullet that struck the entity produced a sound like a hammer hitting a bag of wet sand. It stood there, taking the lead, its head lolling to one side as the Mateja mask began to liquefy. One witness described the sound it made as it was shot, not a cry of pain, but a high-pitched burst of static, the sound of a radio lost between stations, a screaming void of white noise. It took dozens of rounds to finally bring it down. When the militia finally approached the heap of grey tissue and ruined clothing, they found something that defied every law of biology. The entity's body was a shifting mass of undifferentiated matter. Proportions were still changing even in death, arms shrinking, rib cage expanding, a frantic, mindless attempt to find a shape that would hold. The skin was the worst part. It was a separate layer, a thick, leathery membrane that didn't fit the musculature beneath. It was too large in some places and too tight in others, stretched until it was transparent over jagged, non-human bone structures. There were no organs inside, no heart to stop, no lungs to fail. Just a dense, fibrous core that smelled of ozone and ancient, stagnant water. They didn't take it to a lab. They didn't call the authorities. They knew that some things are too broken for science to fix. They dragged the heap of shifting meat back to the graveyard under the cover of a moonless night. They dug a hole directly beneath the spot where the real Mateja Valenzuela was to be buried. They wanted the weight of the man to hold down the thing that had stolen his life. As I stand here now, looking at Mateja's headstone, I can see the effects of that burial. The earth around his grave doesn't just sink, it ripples. On nights when the wind dies down and the desert silence becomes absolute, you can stand near his plot and hear it. It isn't a voice. It's a low, vibrating hum that vibrates in your teeth. a lingering echo of static from a soul that was never a soul at all. The reflections in the polished granite of the nearby markers always look wrong when you stand too close. They're distorted, pulled toward the ground, as if the thing buried beneath Mateo is still trying to find a face that fits. It's a reminder that in this part of New Mexico, you never truly know who is standing in the flickering light of your hallway. Sometimes, the person you love is just a shroud for a void that is waiting for its turn to speak your name. I closed the folder on Mateo, my fingers trembling against the yellowed parchment. The air in the archive felt thinner now, heavy with the scent of ozone and something much older, something like the smell of a basement that hasn't been opened in 1,000 years. But there was one more file. One more incident buried at the very bottom of the crate, wrapped in a plastic shroud as if to keep the rot of the words from leaking out into the rest of the world. This was the expansion project of 1974, the North Sector, the place where the grass never grows, and where the wind seems to die before it can cross the fence line. Victor was the foreman then, a man of iron and calloused hands who didn't believe in ghosts or the shifting shadows of the New Mexico desert. He was hired to push the cemetery's borders further into the scrubland, to carve out more room for the quiet residents of our county. But 40 feet into the expansion, the backhoe hit something that didn't sound like rock. It was a dull, echoing thud, a sound that vibrated through the metal of the machine and into the marrow of the operator's bones. They cleared the dirt by hand, thinking they'd found an old cellar or a forgotten vault. What they unearthed was a slab of stone the size of a freight car. It was impossibly smooth, blacker than a moonless night, and etched with symbols that seemed to move if you looked at them for too long. Victor's report describes them not as writing, but as scars in the stone, jagged geometries that defied the eye's attempt to focus. They weren't human. They weren't even terrestrial. They looked like the static on a dead television channel given physical form. The crew should have stopped. They should have covered it back up and salted the earth. But curiosity is a rot that eats at the common sense of men. Victor stayed late that night with 4 of his best men, determined to see what lay beneath the slab. They used heavy chains and a diesel winch to heave the stone aside. The report says that as the seal broke, a sound escaped the trench. It wasn't a scream. It was a low-frequency hum that made their teeth ache and their vision blur into a grey, grainy soup. When the sun rose over the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, a deputy found the site. The silence was absolute. Not even the crickets dared to speak. The 5 men were scattered around the open trench like discarded dolls. Their eyes were wide, fixed on the empty sky, their faces frozen in a mask of realization so profound it had transcended fear. There wasn't a scratch on them. No blood. No struggle. The coroner would later state that all 5 men had suffered simultaneous, total cardiac failure. It was as if their hearts had simply reached a consensus that the world was no longer a place worth beating in. The file contains a handwritten testimony from the sheriff who led the response that following night. He didn't come alone. He brought 6 men armed with deer rifles and shotguns, sensing that whatever had stopped those 5 hearts was still lingering in the dark of that trench. They set up a perimeter, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the thick, stagnant air of the North Sector. At midnight, the static returned. The sheriff described a shape rising from the black maw of the earth. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a creature of flesh and bone. It was a vertical void, a tear in the fabric of the night that stood 7 feet tall. And then, the eyes opened. They didn't reflect the light of the torches. They burned from within like the doors of a furnace kicked open in the middle of a blizzard. They were a searing, hateful orange, the color of a dying star. The command was given to fire. The desert exploded with the roar of Winchesters and Remingtons. The sheriff watched through the muzzle flashes as the lead buried itself in the entity. There was no spray of crimson, no grunt of pain. Each bullet that hit the thing sounded like a stone being dropped into a deep, wet well. The entity didn't flinch. It didn't retreat. It just stood there, its furnace eyes drifting from man to man, measuring the rhythm of their pulses, waiting for the moment to flick the switch and turn them off. The men panicked. They emptied their magazines into the darkness, the air filling with the smell of burnt powder and the metallic tang of terror. One deputy swore he saw the bullets slow down as they approached the entity, as if the very gravity around it was heavy and thick like syrup. The creature moved then, a jerky, flickering motion that bypassed the space between steps. It was suddenly 10 feet closer, the heat radiating from its eyes scorching the air, turning the oxygen into something that tasted like ash and copper. In a moment of desperate, primal instinct, the sheriff ordered the remaining crew to the bulldozers. They didn't try to kill the thing anymore. They tried to erase it. Under a hail of frantic, suppressive fire, the heavy machinery roared to life. They pushed tons of desert soil, rock, and the heavy black slab back into the trench. They didn't stop until the hole was filled, until the ground was leveled, and the winch was buried along with whatever they had let out. The sheriff's report ends with a chilling observation. He wrote that even after the dirt had covered those burning red eyes, he could still feel the hum. He could feel his own heart stuttering in his chest, trying to sync its rhythm with the vibrations coming from beneath the earth. He told the county to strike the north sector from the maps. He told them to leave the trench as it was, a cardiac trench, a place where the living are not permitted to linger. I put the file back. My own heart feels heavy, a lump of lead in my ribs that I'm suddenly, painfully aware of. I look out my window at the graveyard, past the row where the Behemoth sinks, past the headstone where Matea's shadow waits for a face, out to the far north sector. In the distance, where the grass turns to dust and the fence line begins to sag, I see it. Just for a second. A flicker of orange light, like a spark from a fire that refuses to go out. I'm the groundskeeper here. I mow the grass, I dig the graves, and I keep the peace between the world of the sun and the world of the soil. But I know now that I'm not just a gardener. I'm a jailer, and the locks are getting old. The New Mexico dirt is dry and restless, and beneath it, the things we tried to kill are waiting for the static to return, waiting for someone else to find a slab of stone that looks just a little too smooth to be natural. I reach for my keys and my flashlight. The sun is setting, and the shadows are beginning to stretch, reaching out like long, thin fingers toward the heart of the cemetery. I have to go out there. I have to make sure the soil hasn't shifted. Because in this place, the dead don't just rest. They wait. And some of them have eyes that never close, burning in the dark, waiting for the beat of a heart to stop so they can finally step back into the light. The desert doesn't forgive, but this graveyard remembers. I sit in the small, cramped office of the gatehouse, the yellowed pages of the Unofficial Records spread out before me like the skin of a flayed beast. Outside, the New Mexico dawn is beginning to bleed over the horizon, but it isn't a sunrise. It is a bruised, purple smear against a sky that feels too heavy to breathe. The air in here is thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of dried ink, mixed with a deeper, more offensive odor that seems to seep up through the floorboards, the smell of earth that has been forced to hold onto things it was never meant to contain. I look at my hands. They are calloused, stained with the grey silt of this barren land, and they tremble. Not from the cold, though the high desert air is sharp enough to cut, but from the weight of what I now know. I am not a groundskeeper. I am a jailer. This isn't a place for mourning. It's a vault for the things that the world tried to erase. I think about Elias. I think about that patch of ground where his livestock died, the soil now a dead, black scab on the face of the earth. The records describe the creature he fought in clinical, terrifying detail, but they don't capture the sheer wrongness of it. A beast with a ridged spine and eyes like burning coals, something that shouldn't exist in a world governed by logic. I walked over that grave last night. The silence there isn't natural. In the rest of the cemetery, you might hear the scuttle of a lizard or the distant cry of a coyote, but above that unmarked mound, the world goes dead. The air turns into a thick, vibrating static that makes your teeth ache. I could almost feel the phantom itch of the necrotizing infection that took Elias, a rot that didn't just eat his flesh, but seemed to consume his very history. He lies there, a few yards from the thing that killed him, and I wonder if their bones are tangling together in the dark, a permanent knot of predator and prey, fused by a venom that defies biology. The soil there will never grow so much as a weed. It is a void in the landscape, a hole where life simply refuses to venture. Then there is the row where the survey crew lies. The Behemoth. Every time I walk that line of graves, I have to bring extra fill dirt. It doesn't matter how much I pack into those depressions. The earth continues to sink, a slow, rhythmic collapse as if the massive thing buried beneath is still settling, still heavy enough to pull the horizon down with it. Silas, Tobias, men who were broken by something that absorbed rifle fire like it was rain. I can see the indentations in the dirt, the way the soil pulls away from the headstones as if the ground itself is trying to distance itself from the cargo it carries. When the wind howls through the rocky hills nearby, it sounds like the snapping of ribs, like the blunt force trauma that ended Silas's life. I find myself staring at the sinking earth, half expecting to see a massive, grey hand burst through the surface, not to escape, but to drag the rest of the world down into that suffocating, lightless pressure. The posse that killed it needed sustained volleys to the chest and head, a mechanical, violent erasure of a physical impossibility. And now, I'm the one who has to make sure the dirt stays level. I'm the one who has to pretend that whatever is down there is truly dead, and not just waiting for the pressure to equalize. The story of Mateo is the one that keeps me from looking in the mirror. The doppelganger. The mimic. The records describe the entity's skin not fitting its skull, a shifting, oily wrongness that tried to inhabit a man's life. I look at Mateo's headstone, and I know that directly beneath his coffin lies the thing that wore his face. A double burial. The townspeople thought they were being poetic, or perhaps they were just too terrified to put the thing anywhere else. When I pass that spot, the air feels thin, like a veil that's been stretched until it's transparent. I find myself listening for footsteps that don't match my own, for a jerky, rhythmic clicking of joints that sounds like a clock being wound by a trembling hand. The idea of a creature that echoes words instead of speaking them, that moves with the precision of a broken marionette, it turns the blood to ice. I think about Elena, his sister, realizing the thing in her house wasn't her brother because of the way it said her name. Sometimes, when the wind catches the corner of the gatehouse, I hear a voice call my name, Marcus, but the timing is just a second off, the pitch too flat, too mechanical. I don't look out the window. I just keep my eyes on the dirt. And then, there is the expansion zone. Section 4. The place where the sun never seems to reach, even at high noon. The records regarding the ancient slab are the most guarded, the ink nearly black with the urgency of the warnings. Victor and his crew, found with their eyes wide open, their hearts simply stopping in unison. No trauma, no blood, just a sudden, absolute cessation of life. The entity with eyes like furnace coals. They didn't even try to move it. They just collapsed the trench, burying the mystery and the monsters under tons of New Mexico caliche. When I walk near that section, the air turns cold enough to frost my breath, even in the middle of a desert summer. The symbols on the slab, according to the sketches in the file, aren't just unrecognizable. They are offensive to the eye, shapes that seem to move when you aren't looking directly at them. I can feel the presence of that trench like a physical weight on my chest. It's a pocket of pure, unfiltered vacuum, a place where the logic of the living world has been overwritten by something older, something that doesn't bleed and doesn't care about the passage of time. I have to go out there now. The misty dawn light is cold, a pale, sickly grey that offers no warmth. I have to check the perimeter. I have to make sure the soil hasn't shifted over the slab. I have to ensure the Behemoth's grave hasn't sunk another 6 inches. I have to verify that the dead soil over the mutation is still as sterile as a cauterized wound. People think a graveyard is a place of peace, a final rest for the weary. They don't understand that some things don't go into the ground to rest. They go there because we have nowhere else to put them. They are the secrets of the county, the aberrations that the light of day couldn't tolerate. My boots crunch on the gravel path, and the sound is deafening in the pre-dawn stillness. The mist clings to the grass, a low-hanging shroud that hides the bases of the monuments. I feel the eyes. Not the eyes of the grieving, but the eyes that never close. The orange glow of the mutation, the furnace coal stare of the slab dweller, the hollow, mimic gaze of the doppelganger. They are all down there, laid beneath the strata of history and silence. I am the only one who knows the layout of this prison. I am the only one who knows that the containment zone isn't a government facility or a steel bunker. It's 6 feet of earth and the collective amnesia of a terrified town. The static in the air is getting louder now, a low hum that vibrates in my marrow. It's the sound of the graveyard breathing. Or perhaps it's the sound of the entities trying to scream through the weight of the soil. I reach the edge of the expansion zone and stop. The ground here is undisturbed, but the silence is different. It's a predatory silence. It's the silence of a trap that has been set for eons, waiting for someone to stumble. I look down at my shovel, the wood worn smooth by my grip. It feels like a pathetic weapon against things that can snap a man's spine like a dry twig or stop a heart with a glance. I have to make sure the soil hasn't shifted. Because if the earth moves, if the seals break, if the containment fails, then the things we buried will come back. And they won't come back as ghosts. They will come back as the same visceral, rotting, unnatural nightmares that required a militia to put down. They will come back with a hunger that has been sharpened by decades of darkness. The sun is finally breaking over the hills, but it brings no comfort. It just reveals the scars on the land, the patches of dead dirt, the sinking holes, the unmarked stones. I turn back toward the gatehouse, my shadows stretching long and jagged across the graves of the men who died keeping these secrets. I can feel the heat of the desert starting to rise, but the core of me is still frozen. I'll be back tonight. I'll be back every night. Because in this place, the dead don't just rest. They wait. They wait for the heartbeat of the world to falter. They wait for the jailer to blink. And as I walk away, I swear I can hear the soil shifting behind me, a dry, rasping sound like 1,000 insects moving under the skin of the world. I